250 years ago, 56 men signed a document that changed the world. Yesterday, dozens of people made sure those words still ring out loud in Houlton. On the steps of the Houlton Chamber of Commerce, people of all ages took turns at the microphone, from children to senior citizens, each reading a piece of the Declaration of Independence. The event was designed to reflect the whole community.
We decided to have the Declaration divided into 32 different parts and to see how much diversity across ages, different segments of the community, people who have lived here their whole life and for generations, people who have just recently moved, people who immigrated to the United States and became citizens later, and I think we accomplished that.
Houlton wasn't alone. DeMarco says she knows of 6 other places in Maine that read the Declaration of Independence, including one at City Hall in Presque Isle. Officials with the Chamber of Commerce are now talking about making this a tradition for the town.